His own son shoved them off the cliff to silence them, and as their bodies slammed into the rocks below, the father gripped his wife's hand and whispered through broken breath, "Pretend we're dead." The betrayal cut deeper than the fall itself, the kind of treachery no parent ever imagines from the child they raised. Shock, rage, disbelief all collided in that single instant, where survival meant secrecy. What drove a son to such cruelty, and how far would the father go when he rose from the shadows? Subscribe now. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't miss what comes next. The rocks did not care who they caught. His body crashed against them with a force that rattled through bone and marrow, each jagged edge cutting into skin until blood warmed the cold stone. Pain screamed through every nerve, but even that agony could not compare to the hollow devastation consuming him. He had lived long enough to know what broken ribs felt like, to know how lungs burned when air refused to come, but nothing in all his years prepared him for the truth that burned deeper than the wounds his own son had wanted him dead. That knowledge seared hotter than any fracture, more vicious than any gash. He forced his eyes open, blinking against the sting of dust and blood trickling down his face. The world tilted in and out of focus, shadows of branches overhead swaying like cruel witnesses. Beside him, his wife coughed, her fragile frame shuddering with each labored breath. Her hand clawed blindly for his searching, not just for comfort, but for proof that he was still there. He caught it, squeezing back with what strength remained. Their bodies might have been broken, but the bond between them was unyielding. Still, when her eyes met his, he saw the same unbearable truth reflected. The boy they raised with their own hands had delivered this fate. The mind reaches backward in such moments, clawing at memory as though finding an explanation might dull the horror. He saw their son as a child again, racing barefoot through summer grass, cheeks flushed, laughter bright. He remembered the nights spent fixing toys under dim light, the mornings waking early to make sure lunch was packed, the endless years of labor to put food on the table and clothes on his back. Each sacrifice rose before him like ghosts mocking his gullibility. Every memory twisted into a knife, because it was that same boy, grown hardened, unrecognizable, who had stood above the cliff's edge with ice in his eyes and murder in his heart. The pain in his chest was not from the cracked ribs, but from the collapse of belief. Parents tell themselves that no matter how cruel the world becomes, blood will remain sacred. Yet here he was, lying among shattered stones, blood spilling from his side, because the child he had once cradled in trembling arms decided their lives were disposable. The father clenched his jaw, choking back a sound that wanted to escape, something between a groan and a howl. Not for his wounds, but for the death of faith. The wife shifted, whispering through ragged breath that she could not move her leg. He looked down and saw the angle of bone beneath skin, a sight that turned his stomach. He wanted to weep for her, but tears would not come. They had no place here, not while survival was in question. He pressed his hand against her shoulder, steadying her trembling. His voice was calm, though his insides raged, telling her to hold on, to breathe, to fight against the darkness pulling at her edges. She nodded weakly, trust filling her eyes even as agony bent her body. Above them the wind carried fragments of laughter. The son's voice, low and triumphant, lingered faintly before fading into silence. The father closed his eyes, the sound cutting him deeper than stone. That voice used to call him Dad with warmth. That same mouth now laughed after pushing them into oblivion. He dug his fingers into the earth, clutching soil as though he could anchor himself to something real, something untainted. Every breath was punishment. His lungs felt like torn paper, each inhale sharp, each exhale heavier than the last. Pain clawed at his spine, sending sparks down his limbs. He wondered for a brief second if death might be easier than enduring this torment. Yet as soon as the thought formed, it was crushed by rage. Dying would give his son what he wanted. To live, no matter how broken, would be defiance. He turned to his wife again, brushing dirt from her face with trembling fingers. Her lips were pale, but her eyes, those eyes that had once steadied him through decades of struggle, still burned with fire. He whispered that they were not finished, not here, not like this. She nodded faintly, though her pain etched deep lines across her face. That small movement was enough. If she could fight, so would he. The night crept in, wrapping them in cold. Each hour stretched into eternity. Coyotes howled in the distance, a reminder that nature itself circled waiting for weakness. He gathered stones, dragging himself inch by inch, building a crude barrier around them. Every motion tore at his body, but purpose dulled the pain. Protect her, that was the only command his mind would allow. When he paused, muscles trembling, memories forced their way back again. He recalled the day his son graduated, how proud he had felt, seeing him in a cap and gown, tears burning his eyes as he clapped louder than anyone in the crowd. He had thought then that every sacrifice had been worth it. He had believed in that future. Now that same son had shoved him into an abyss, trading love for ambition, compassion for betrayal. The father wanted to scream into the night, but silence was his shield. If their son believed them dead, that belief was the only advantage they had. The wife drifted in and out of consciousness, her grip on his hand weakening, then tightening again. He whispered stories into her ear, fragments of their life together, not for nostalgia, but for survival. Words gave them something to hold, threads connecting them to who they once were, rather than what they had become. He told her about the first home they bought, the rusty truck they fixed up together, the nights they sat on the porch, watching storms roll across the plains. He painted pictures in the darkness, because if she could imagine more than pain, then she could endure it. Hours bled into dawn. Light seeped through the trees above, painting the rocks in gold. His body screamed for rest, but the sight of that first sliver of sun reminded him that survival was possible. If they had endured the night, they could endure more. Yet the morning also sharpened the knife of betrayal. A new day should bring hope, but for him it only magnified the shadow of his son's treachery. He pulled himself upright against the rocks, breath ragged, surveying the cliff walls that now looked more like a prison than a path. Climbing out seemed impossible, yet impossibility had never stopped him before. Every business he built, every hardship he overcame, had begun with odds stacked against him. He spat blood onto the dirt, tasting iron, and muttered that their son had underestimated them. Beside him, his wife stirred, her eyes half open, pain carved into her face, but was still alive in her gaze. He squeezed her hand once more and promised they would not die here. His voice was a vow, steel edged with fire. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the agony, beneath the heartbreak, something colder had awakened. Betrayal had cut him down, but it had also forged him into something new. And as he listened to the wind whistling through the canyon, carrying with it the memory of his son's final words before leaving them for dead, he knew this was not the end. This was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. What he would do when he finally stood face to face with his son again was a secret even the dawn could not yet reveal. The cold stone beneath him carried more than his broken weight. It carried the ghosts of every sacrifice he had made. Pain blurred his vision, but memory cut sharper than any wound. He remembered the years when 16-hour days were not a choice, but a necessity. The mornings that began before sunrise with calloused hands gripping tools, and the nights that ended long after the town's lights went dark. He had built houses for strangers while his own roof leaked patched roads others would drive, while his truck coughed smoke on winter mornings. Every drop of sweat had been a promise his son would never know. Hunger, never feel the weight of despair that had once haunted his own youth. He saw himself again in the factory heat, suffocating machines roaring louder than thought. His shirt clung with sweat, and still he bent his back over the line, repeating the motion until his muscles screamed. Paychecks barely stretched, but somehow he found a way to cover tuition bills that came in thick envelopes stamped urgent in red. He remembered signing those checks with hands that trembled not from doubt, but from exhaustion. Each stroke of the pen was another brick laid in the foundation of his son's future. The memory shifted to nights at the kitchen table, bills spread out like a battlefield. His wife sat across from him, her eyes tired but steady. He told her they would manage, that somehow they always did. He worked overtime while she clipped coupons, both of them sacrificing quietly so their son could stand tall one day. They skipped vacations, drove the same dented car, wore shoes longer than they should have all. so he could walk through college halls without shame. He remembered the pride that swelled in his chest at graduation, rows of Cap's young voices singing with promise, and his son in the middle, shaking hands with professors. Tears had blurred his eyes that day, the good kind, the kind that tasted like victory after decades of labor. He clapped until his palms stung, shouted until his throat burned. That moment had been worth every sleepless night, every ache in his body. Or so he had believed. Now lying in the dirt with his ribs grinding against bone, those same memories twisted into barbed wire. The boy who had been given every chance, who had walked a path paved with his father's sacrifices, had answered love with betrayal. The man who once lifted him on his shoulders so he could see fireworks above the crowd had been shoved into darkness by the same hands. The father's breath caught as he thought of the house they built together. He had hammered every nail, laid every plank painting walls late into the night. His son had toddled through the half-finished rooms, laughing while he dreamed of a future where the boy would one day bring his own children to visit. He could still smell the sawdust, still feel the weight of beams hoisted into place by sheer will. That house was not just wood and stone. It was his heart, his legacy, and he had given it freely. The bitterness rose like bile. He remembered the tuition checks, $48,000 in 4 years, a sum that had nearly broken them. He had driven old tools longer than they were safe, had eaten canned beans 3 nights a week, all to keep his son from carrying debt. He remembered patching the soles of his work boots with duct tape while buying his son new textbooks without hesitation. And for what? So the boy could grow into a man who looked down at his parents as obstacles, not as the pillars that carried him forward. Regret coiled inside him, heavy and suffocating. If only he had said no more often. If only he had taught his son that love did not mean endless giving. Maybe this moment would not exist. Maybe his son would have learned gratitude instead of greed. Yet regret was useless here among the rocks. It could not mend broken bones or erase the sting of betrayal. His wife stirred beside him, her breath shallow. He tightened his grip on her hand, grounding himself in the present, though the past clawed at him. She had stood by his side through every sacrifice, every compromise. She had cooked when money ran thin, mended clothes so their son could walk into school without shame, smiled through her own exhaustion, so he would not feel the burden. Together, they had built a life brick by brick, dollar by dollar. And together they now paid the price for raising a son who had mistaken love for weakness. The father's mind flickered to the night he bought his son's first car, a rusted Ford he had spent months fixing after long shifts. He remembered handing over the keys, watching his son's eyes light up. Pride had surged in him then, a fire that burned away every ache. He thought he was giving freedom. Now he realized he had given entitlement. That car had been the first of many gifts, each one eroding the boy's sense of responsibility until nothing remained but greed. The taste of iron filled his mouth as he spat blood onto the dirt. The sound of wind against the cliff mixed with the echo of his son's voice calling him a burden, a liability. He clenched his teeth, fury pulsing hotter than pain. How quickly a lifetime of giving had been erased, discarded as though it had never mattered. The boy who once begged him for bedtime stories had rewritten their history with one shove. Yet beneath the bitterness, a spark remained. Memory had not only brought regret, but also resolve. He remembered the long nights when quitting was easier, when exhaustion nearly broke him, but he had kept going. He remembered the times he stood against foremen, against storms, against every obstacle that dared to tell him he couldn't. Those years had forged him into iron, and iron did not crumble even here at the bottom of a ravine. His chest rose in a ragged breath, pain lacing every inhale, but the fire inside refused to dim. Sacrifice had made him strong, and betrayal would make him dangerous. He turned his head toward the rising light filtering through the trees, the first hint of morning. It reminded him of every dawn he had faced after nights of toil, every sunrise that had greeted him when fatigue tried to claim him. Dawn meant survival, and survival meant another chance. He squeezed his wife's hand again, steady and deliberate. He whispered that their story was not over, not yet, not by a long shot. What they had given could not be erased with one act of treachery. The son who betrayed them had awakened something he would soon come to fear. Because a man who has given everything and lost it all has nothing left to surrender except his fury. And as the first rays of sunlight spread across the cliff face, he knew the past was no longer just memory. It was fuel. And fuel once lit burns hotter than fire. What he would do with that fire when he finally stood again would not just shake his son's world, it would tear it apart. The father dragged in a broken breath, every inhale a jagged blade against his ribs, and forced his eyes upward toward the rim of the cliff. Through the blur of blood and dust, he caught the silhouette of his son framed against the sky. No panic, no hesitation, no sign of regret. Just stillness. The boy stood like a judge who had already delivered a verdict, shoulders squared, face set in that mask of indifference that turned him from flesh and blood into a stranger. His eyes scanned the canyon floor, not with fear, but with the detached calculation of someone confirming a job was finished. The father felt a tremor run through him that had nothing to do with the fall. That cold stare pierced deeper than broken bones ever could. It was the gaze of a man who had stripped himself of empathy, who had looked at his own parents and seen not life, but obstacles. The son shifted his stance, placing his hands in his pockets as if he were waiting for silence to seal itself over the cliff. The wind carried his outline in a cruel dance of shadows, and for one chilling heartbeat, the father saw not a son, but an executioner. The wife whimpered beside him, her voice barely audible. He tightened his grip on her hand and forced his gaze back upward. The boy leaned forward slightly, peering down into the ravine with the same detachment he might use to inspect a freshly signed contract. The father's chest clenched, not from the ribs grinding inside him, but from the ice spreading through his veins. He had expected shock, maybe fear at what had just been done. Instead, he saw only calculation, a man confirming that his plan had worked. Memories of sacrifice still lingered fresh in his mind, and now they collided with this unbearable truth. The child who once clung to his neck whispering, "I love you," in sleepy tones, now stood above him as though watching the final scene of a performance he had orchestrated. That realization turned pain into rage. His son's apathy was worse than hatred. It was erasure. To look upon their suffering and feel nothing was to declare them already gone. The father clenched his jaw until it ached, refusing to give the boy the satisfaction of seeing him beg. His wife tried to shift a moan escaping her lips, and he pulled her closer, shielding her with what little strength he had left. Above them the boy straightened, adjusting his jacket as if dusting off the act of betrayal itself. He did not look back down again. He simply turned and walked away. That retreat was colder than the shove that had sent them tumbling. The sound of gravel crunching beneath his son's shoes echoed in the father's ears, every step hammering the truth deeper. This was not an accident, not a burst of rage. It was a plan. Thought out, deliberate, merciless. And that knowledge ignited a fury that burned hotter than any wound. The father tried to push himself upright, pain shooting through his arms and chest. He needed to see more, needed to etch every detail of that indifference into memory. Through the haze, he caught one last glimpse of his son disappearing into the tree line. Shoulders loose, stride, unhurried, as though he were simply leaving a meeting that had gone exactly as expected. No glance back, no hesitation, no sign of humanity. Tears threatened to break through the father's eyes, but he swallowed them. Not here, not now. To weep would be to admit defeat. Instead, he let the rage carve itself into resolve. The boy's coldness had sliced something inside him clean through, but it had also lit something new, a flame that would not die. If his son had planned this moment as an ending, he was wrong. It would be the beginning. He lowered himself back down beside his wife, brushing strands of hair from her bloodied face. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed with pain, and he whispered that they were still alive, that they would remain alive no matter what. Her lips trembled as though she wanted to believe him. He kissed her forehead, tasting dust and sweat, and his heart fractured further at the thought that she too had seen their son's empty eyes. She too had felt the betrayal. Night began to stretch its claws across the sky, shadows thickening along the canyon walls. The father watched as darkness swallowed the rim where his son had stood moments before. He listened to the silence that followed, a silence that carried no remorse, only the echo of footsteps leaving two broken bodies to rot. He inhaled sharply, fighting against the pain, and felt something inside him harden. If his son believed this was the end, he had underestimated the man he tried to erase. The ache of betrayal gnawed at him, but beneath it a clarity took root. The boy's cold eyes had stripped away every illusion of love that once blinded him. There was no innocence left, no misunderstanding. There was only intent, deliberate and ruthless. And if that intent was to erase them, then the father's intent would be to rise from the grave his son had dug and bring the reckoning he deserved. The wind whistled across the canyon floor, carrying with it the memory of that indifferent stare. The father closed his eyes, burned the image into his mind, and let it fuse with his rage. Betrayal had broken his body, but it had also forged his will into steel. And in the silence that followed, as his wife drifted into uneasy sleep beside him, he made a vow the night itself seemed to hear. The son believed he had buried them in darkness. But dawn was coming, and with it a father who would no longer give, no longer forgive, but only take back everything that had been stolen. What that dawn would reveal was a truth his son could never imagine. The father felt the weight of death pressing against his chest, every heartbeat a countdown echoing inside broken ribs. The world around him blurred with pain, but his mind refused to give in to the darkness clawing at the edges. His body lay battered among the rocks, but when his hand brushed against the jagged edge of a branch lodged into the cliff wall, instinct took over. He clamped down, fingers curling around the splintered wood until it pierced his skin. Blood welled beneath his nails, but he didn't let go. That branch was no miracle. It was defiance, and defiance was all he had left. Above him the wind hissed through the trees, carrying the fading memory of his son's footsteps. His jaw locked, the muscles tightening with more than pain. It was resolve. Let the boy believe the fall had finished the job. Let him walk away, certain that the silence below meant the end. But the father knew better. Death would not come so easily, not while vengeance pulsed hotter than blood in his veins. He anchored his weight, dragging air into lungs that fought him with every inhale. Each breath tore through him like fire, but he held steady, pressing his back against the cold stone. His wife stirred weakly beside him, her broken leg trembling as she tried to move. He tightened his grip on the branch, and then on her hand, linking them both to the fragile thread of survival. Her eyes fluttered open, cloudy with pain, but when they met his, something unspoken passed between them. They would not give their son the victory of thinking they were gone. The father shifted slowly, the movement sending knives of agony up his spine. He ignored them, inching himself closer to his wife, using the branch as leverage. His mind sharpened, calculating each motion, each breath, each heartbeat. This wasn't survival born from chance. It was survival born from refusal. He refused to die in a hole dug by betrayal. He refused to let his story end at the hands of the boy he had once carried on his shoulders. The ground beneath them was treacherous, loose gravel sliding away with the smallest touch. One wrong move and the canyon would claim them for good. Still he pressed forward. He whispered to his wife, his voice low, steady, commanding her not to give up. He told her to close her eyes and imagine the dawn, to believe in the promise of light, even when darkness pressed down. Her trembling slowed, her breath steadied, and though she winced with each shift, she gripped his hand back with surprising force. The night deepened, shadows swallowing the canyon walls. Cold crept in, sinking into his bones, trying to convince him to surrender. But he had lived with cold before, the kind that seeps in when bills outpace paychecks, when hunger outpaces food. He had fought through worse in another lifetime, and he would fight through this. The father adjusted his grip, wrapping his bleeding fingers tighter around the branch until the pain became fuel. He was not clinging to life. He was gripping the chance to rise again. The silence of the canyon mocked him. somewhere far above the world, moved on unaware that two broken souls lay hidden in its shadow. He listened for any sign of his son returning, for the crack of branches underfoot, but there was nothing. That absence only solidified his resolve. If his son believed they were dead, then he had given them a weapon more powerful than strength and visibility. They could move unseen plan without suspicion, and one day strike when the boy least expected. His thoughts sharpened further as the hours crawled by. He forced himself to stay awake every blink, a battle against exhaustion. He studied the walls of the ravine, tracing potential paths upward, measuring them not by ease but by possibility. His body screamed in protest, but his mind catalogued every ledge, every route, every handhold. He was a builder, a man who had once raised homes from empty lots. He knew how to find structure in chaos, foundation in ruin. That knowledge was his weapon now. The wife's breathing steadied, though pain twisted her features in the dim light. He pressed his forehead against hers, whispering that dawn would come, that they would see it together. He promised her their story was not finished. He promised her their son would one day look into their eyes again and see not victims but survivors who had risen from the grave he dug for them. The hours stretched on, measured only by the pounding of blood in his ears. His grip on the branch never loosened. Splinters embedded themselves deeper, but pain had become irrelevant. The branch was more than wood. It was defiance carved into the earth itself. Every second he held on was another second he stole from death, another moment closer to retribution. At last, the faintest line of silver crept across the sky. Dawn. The father's breath hitched and his chest burned with both agony and triumph. Light spilled down the canyon walls, turning jagged stone into fire. He felt his wife stir, her eyes opening to the faint glow. For the first time since the fall, he saw something flicker across her face. Hope. He lifted his gaze toward the rim, squinting against the rising sun. His son's silhouette was gone, swallowed by trees and distance, but the memory of that cold stare still burned. The boy thought he had written the final chapter. He thought the canyon had swallowed his parents whole. But as the father pulled air into battered lungs and tightened his grip one last time, he knew the truth. Survival was not luck. Survival was choice, and his choice was clear. He would rise not just to live, but to make his son face the reckoning he had earned. The canyon had not become their grave, it had become their crucible, and when they emerged broken but alive, the world above would tremble. The father leaned close to his wife, his voice low, steady, sharp as a blade. He told her this was only the beginning, and as the sun climbed higher, painting the cliff in gold, he knew the time was coming when survival would no longer be enough. What he would do next would turn survival into something far more dangerous. The father pulled his wife against him, every nerve in his battered body screaming as he shifted, but the pain was nothing compared to the terror in her eyes. Her breaths came shallow, lips pale, her leg twisted in a way that told him the break was severe. For a moment the fear clawed at him, the thought that he might lose her here in this pit carved by betrayal. He pressed his forehead to hers, closing his eyes, letting her warmth steady the tremor in his chest. His arms wrapped around her, not as a shield against the cold or the jagged stones beneath them, but as a vow that as long as his heart beat she would not face this nightmare alone. He whispered her name, the sound low and ragged, yet it carried the weight of decades together. Memories bled through the haze of pain the first time he saw her on a rain-soaked street, her laughter echoing brighter than thunder, the vows spoken beneath a wooden church roof, the nights they lay awake dreaming of the life they would build. Those memories rose like anchors against the storm of fear. He told her to breathe, to hold on, to trust him. She trembled against him, her fingers weak but determined as they clutched his shirt. Even broken, even on the edge of death, she answered his fear with a silent promise of her own she would not let go. The canyon pressed down around them, shadows stretching like the arms of a grave. Coyotes cried in the distance, and the wind whistled through the trees above, carrying the scent of pine and the ghost of their son's betrayal. He felt her tears against his neck, hot and bitter, and he whispered words he barely believed himself. He told her they would rise from this, that dawn would not find them corpses, but survivors. His voice shook, his body quivered, but the conviction in his tone steadied her. Sometimes strength is not the absence of fear, but the choice to speak through it. She lifted her hand to his face, tracing the blood on his cheek with trembling fingers. Her touch was light, yet it burned deeper than any wound. In that moment he realized that survival was no longer just his will, it was theirs. Their lives were no longer separate, not even in this abyss. Every breath he took was for her, and every breath she forced into her lungs was for him. Together, they carried a strength neither could summon alone. He adjusted his hold, wrapping his coat tighter around her, ignoring the sting of cold air against his own wounds. Her head rested against his chest, her ear pressed to the rhythm of his heartbeat. The sound became her anchor, proof that life still pulsed despite the violence of betrayal. He whispered again, softer this time, recounting the small victories of their life together. He told her of the nights they had nothing but each other, and how that had always been enough. She smiled faintly, though pain etched lines deeper into her face. That smile became his fuel. Hours crawled by, and fatigue tried to swallow them whole. He fought against it, whispering stories to keep her tethered. He spoke of the home they built nail by nail, of the laughter that once filled their kitchen, of the nights they stayed up talking until morning light spilled across their bed. He reminded her that they had survived worse storms, poverty, sickness, the endless trials life had hurled at them. This betrayal might have cut the deepest, but they still had each other, and that bond was a shield no canyon could crush. She clung to his words, her eyes fluttering open, with each one refusing to drift into the silence that beckoned her. The father felt her grip tighten on his hand, weak but insistent. Her voice, barely more than a whisper, asked him not to leave her. He kissed her forehead and swore he never would. His body shook with both pain and terror, but the promise steadied him. In that vow he found something stronger than rage, stronger even than the will to live, the need to keep her alive. The night grew colder, the canyon floor biting at their skin. He rubbed her arms, his hands raw, forcing warmth into her trembling body. His own wounds burned, but he ignored them. Pain was irrelevant. What mattered was the rise and fall of her chest against his, the fragile rhythm that proved she was still with him. Each breath she drew was another battle won, and each moment she leaned into him was proof that together they could defy the fate their son had written for them. He leaned close to her ear and whispered of the future, not the past that bled with regret, not the present that reeked of betrayal, but the future he refused to surrender. He painted images with words, walking out of this canyon hand in hand, standing once more in the sunlight, reclaiming every piece of dignity their son had tried to strip from them. He told her that survival was not optional, that together they would make the world remember who they were. She closed her eyes, a faint nod answering his promise. The hours dragged. But as the first light of dawn edged across the jagged stones, the father felt a shift within himself. Fear no longer ruled him. The tremor in his chest had hardened into something steadier. Holding her against him, he realized that their survival was not just about vengeance or pride. It was about the bond they had forged through every trial, a bond no betrayal could sever. As the sun broke across the horizon, spilling light into the canyon, he kissed the crown of her head and whispered that the worst was behind them. Yet even as he spoke, a shadow stirred in his mind, darker than the night they had endured. He knew the battle was far from over. What waited for them above the canyon was more than survival. It was reckoning. And when that moment came, the strength born from love would transform into something far more dangerous. The father sat with his back pressed against the jagged wall of the ravine, the weight of his wife leaning into him, her breath shallow but steady. The canyon floor was cold, the night still heavy around them, but his mind refused the luxury of despair. Pain raged through his body with every movement, but pain was a distraction, nothing more. He forced himself to see not the blood staining his hands or the fractures screaming inside his ribs, but the landscape of survival. The darkness was no longer just a tomb. It was a map waiting to be read. His eyes scanned the rock face above every crack and shadow etched in his memory. He measured distances the way he once measured lumber-gauged angles, like he had when building frames that held the weight of roofs. Years of labor returned to him not as memories but as tools. He noted the ledge 15 feet above the cluster of roots knotted into the soil like veins of the earth, the jagged outcrop that could bear weight if approached carefully. Each detail became a step in the design of escape. He whispered his observations into his wife's ear, not because she could climb with him, but because the words anchored them both. If she believed in his plan, if she could picture it with him, then neither of them would be lost to fear. Her eyes opened dim but alert, and she nodded faintly. That gesture alone was enough to tighten his resolve. The father tested his grip on the branch that had saved him earlier. Splinters tore deeper into his flesh, but he did not release it. He braced his legs against the rock, feeling the tremor of muscles that had carried him through decades of grueling work. He knew he could not scale the cliff in one burst. His body was too broken for that. But he could move in increments. Small victories, stacked like bricks in a wall, until escape rose from impossibility into reality. The wind shifted, carrying the faint howl of a coyote. It reminded him that time was not his ally. Predators roamed these canyons. If his son's betrayal didn't kill them, hunger and wild teeth would. The urgency sharpened his mind. Every second wasted was another chance for death to reach them before he did. He looked at his wife, brushing her hair back from her face. Her voice was hoarse when she told him to go to climb to find a way out. The fear in her words was not for herself but for him, and he answered it with a kiss to her forehead. He told her he would return, that he would not leave her in the dark. She closed her eyes, trusting him, and he felt the weight of that trust settle like armor across his shoulders. The first attempt nearly broke him. His arms screamed as he hauled himself upward, fingers digging into cracks no wider than a coin. His ribs ground with each pull, forcing bile into his throat. He pushed past it, forcing his body to obey. He reached the first ledge and collapsed against it, chest heaving, blood dripping down his side. For a moment the abyss seemed to call him back, but he clenched his jaw and refused to look down. From the ledge he could see more of the cliff face, another root forming in his mind. Roots dangled above him, strong enough to bear weight if grasped carefully. He reached, stretching until his shoulders felt they might rip apart. His hand closed around them and he pulled again. The climb was no longer about strength, but about will. Inch by inch he rose. Below, his wife's faint voice carried upward, urging him on. That sound was a lifeline stronger than any branch. Every time his grip faltered, every time his body threatened to give out, her voice pushed him higher. He imagined her face in the sunlight, her smile breaking through the pain, and it became fuel. He reached another outcrop and paused. Sweat stinging his eyes, his lungs raw. The canyon stretched endlessly above, but he no longer saw it as impossible. He had mapped the path, and all that remained was to follow it. He marked the final ledge in his mind, a place where he could drag his broken body over the rim and into the world his son thought he had left behind. The night thinned, the stars paling as dawn prepared to rise. He knew he could not finish the climb before light, but he had proven to himself that escape was possible. Sliding back down carefully, he reached his wife again, collapsing beside her. She touched his face, and though her voice was weak, she whispered that she had heard every movement, every breath, and that it meant hope was alive. He held her close, whispering the plan again, every detail, so she could picture it as clearly as he did. He told her he would carry her piece by piece, if that was what it took, or build a way out with his own hands. She believed him, and in her belief he found strength beyond his own broken body. The canyon was no longer their grave. It was their trial. And as the first light crept over the horizon, spilling fire across the rocks, the father knew the time for waiting had ended. What came next would demand everything he had left. But survival was no longer a question. It was a certainty carved into stone. And somewhere beyond that stone in the world above, A son walked free, unaware that his victims were already designing their escape. What the father would do when he finally pulled himself from the canyon was a truth waiting in the dark, a truth sharp enough to cut deeper than betrayal itself. The father leaned against the cold stone, his body battered but his mind unwilling to rest. The canyon around him was silent, yet inside his skull voices clamored louder than the wind. Not the voices of predators lurking in the night. Not even the echoes of his son's footsteps fading into the trees above. These were older voices, softer once voices he had clung to through years of sacrifice. He remembered the boy at 12 standing with a scraped knee and dirt smeared across his cheeks, solemnly declaring he would always protect his parents. The words had been spoken with the unshakable certainty of childhood, as though they were carved into scripture. That memory, once a source of pride, now twisted inside him like a rusted blade. He could still see the boy's eyes wide and shining, swearing that no harm would ever reach them while he lived. How naive he had been to believe it. He had carried that promise through years of work, believing every splinter in his palms, every scar across his back was worth it, because one day that devotion would be returned. Now the same child who once stood like a knight before him had shoved him into darkness with no hesitation, no shame. The promise of protection had decayed into the reality of betrayal. The father tilted his head back against the rock, staring up at the slice of sky visible between jagged edges. Stars burned faintly there, indifferent to his pain. He wondered how he could have been so blind, how he had mistaken greed for ambition, manipulation for maturity. There had been signs, small, sharp glimpses he had ignored. Times when the boy lied easily, times when his gaze lingered too long on what he wanted but did not earn. The father had dismissed them as youth mistakes that would fade with age. He had believed the best in him because that is what parents do. Now that faith mocked him. His wife stirred beside him, her broken voice asking if he was still there. He squeezed her hand and whispered yes, though his throat ached with more than injury. He wanted to tell her the truth burning inside him, that he no longer knew the man their son had become. That somewhere along the way the boy who swore to protect them had vanished, replaced by a stranger wearing his face. But he could not crush what hope she still carried. Instead, he kissed her temple and whispered words of reassurance he barely believed himself. The canyon walls caught every memory he tried to bury. He saw his son in a football uniform scanning the bleachers until his eyes locked on him, grinning with pride. He heard his voice on the night he graduated high school, promising through tears that he would never forget the sacrifices that had carried him there. He remembered the night the boy left for college, hugging him with arms that trembled, swearing again that family was everything. Each image rose like ghosts in the darkness, each one shattering under the weight of what had been done. He pressed a bloodied hand against his chest as though he could claw the betrayal out. It wasn't just the fall that had broken him. It was the knowledge that love had been weaponized against him. That trust had been turned into weakness. His son had learned the contours of their hearts, then used them as blueprints for destruction. That truth was heavier than stone. The wife whispered again this time, reminding him of the boy's laughter when he was small, of how he used to run barefoot through the yard chasing fireflies. She clung to that memory as though it could resurrect the child they had lost. He listened, his chest tightening, and for a fleeting moment he wished he could believe it too. But the image of the boy's indifferent stare from the rim of the cliff seared over every tender recollection. The man above was not chasing fireflies. He was calculating inheritances. The father closed his eyes, letting the bitterness settle like iron. The words, "I will always protect you," rang again in his ears, warped now into mockery. He realized those words had not been a promise but a weapon. His son had learned what they wanted to hear and spoken it to secure more sacrifices, more gifts, more trust. It had worked. For decades it had worked. And the father had been blind, too blinded by love to see the knife being sharpened behind his back. He inhaled sharply, the air cutting like glass through his battered lungs. Rage threatened to consume him, but beneath it something colder grew. The naivety was gone. The illusions were gone. What remained was a clarity sharp enough to draw blood. He no longer looked at his son as family. He looked at him as the architect of betrayal, a man who had turned promises into lies, who had built his future out of their bones. He kissed his wife's hair, whispering that they would rise, though his voice carried an edge he could not hide. She nodded faintly, too weary to hear the steel beneath the words. He looked once more at the slice of sky above where dawn threatened to spill across the world. The boy thought his parents' faith had died with the fall. In truth, faith had transformed into something else entirely. When the father finally stood again, he would no longer carry the weight of promises shattered. He would carry something far sharper. And when his son looked into his eyes, he would not see a father's love anymore. He would see the reflection of every broken vow turned into a reckoning that no lie could escape. He pulled himself out of the gravel as if the earth itself had been trying to swallow him, fingers bloody and numb boots grinding against loose stone. The climb was a mess of raw muscle and stubborn breath, each inch earned with teeth clenched against bone-deep pain. When at last he hauled his ruined body onto a narrow ledge and rolled onto his back, the canyon below looked less like a grave and more like the dark beginning of something that would not end until justice had been paid. He lay there for a long moment, chest-heaving, listening to the landscape breathe around him, and the sound of the world went from indifferent to charged, an audience waiting for the curtain to rise on what he would do next. Anger had been a bright, volatile thing at first, the hot flame of immediate betrayal. Now it settled into something steadier, a metal forged by suffering and memory. He could feel it in his jaw, in the slow, deliberate tightening of his hands, in the way his thoughts no longer ricocheted between hurt and disbelief, but threaded themselves into a single, inevitable purpose. They had tried to bury him and his wife like trash. They had assumed silence would be final. That assumption had been the arrogance of the unrepentant, the mistake of people who believe in their own neatness. He would make that neatness unravel. He thought of the small, careful ways his son had rebuilt his life on their labor. Not the sudden, brutal shove at the cliff, but the years of soft erosion, forging signatures here, taking small sums there, the polite half-truths at family dinners that cloaked a steady appetite. Betrayal tastes different when you can map the theft back to its tiny, patient origins. The father had traced each one like a ledger in his head, and now those entries were no longer abstract wounds. They were blueprints. He had been a builder all his life. He understood plans, pillars, where pressure would split a structure. He would use that knowledge to dismantle the thing his son had built out of their ruin. He rolled onto his side, listening for any sound beyond the wind. Dawn was a thin thread on the horizon, and with it came the first thread of strategy. Survival had been an act of immediate will. Revenge required a patient, surgical mind. He thought through the evidence. He already had paper trails, the accounts he had once kept in a battered ledger. The flicker of a memory where he had seen his son linger over bank statements with a look that had not been there when the boy was young and awe-filled. He remembered the lawyer they had trusted, the way his son had so easily suggested changes to the will, the late-night phone calls that had wrapped themselves around their lives like vines. Details accumulated in his head like stones at the edge of a wall, and each stone became a part of the case he would one day present not only to the law, but to the world. He pictured his son at the rim, indifferent and elegant in his indifference, walking away as if the fall had been a tidy sweep. The man had been practiced, polished, the desertion premeditated. There was a confidence in that cruelty that would be his undoing. People who plan carefully also leave traces, patterns in their carefulness, that the patient eye can see. The father had always been a patient eye, surveying a job until he knew where each nail would go. He would study his son the way he had once studied blueprints, over and over, until every possible weakness became a lever. He let the memory of his wife's hand in his pale but clenched press against his palm like an oath. She had been the constant in his life, the steadying force that had kept him working in the rain, that had mended their clothes without complaint, that had told him with a look when to keep faith and when to hold fast. The thought of her lying in a hospital bed or worse gone because of greed and calculation turned resolve into something darker. This was not about punishment alone, it was about reclamation. He would not only stop his son from taking what remained, but would take back everything that belonged to them: dignity, truth, and the children who were innocent pawns. He pictured how it might unfold. First, he would gather the loose threads into a cord. The ledger would be found. The lawyer's file would show the changes. Conversations that once sounded casual would become evidence. He remembered an old voice recorder tucked away in a drawer of the workshop, a cheap device he had used years ago to capture notes for projects. If the echo of voices could be found there, if the son's smooth reassurances could be plucked from the past, then the narrative that had been spun around them would unravel in the light of recorded truth. He had not believed in heroes, but he believed in proof. Proof would be the blade that cut through the lie. There would be witnesses, too. People who knew different versions of his son, the ones who had seen bills disappear, the mechanic who had been paid off in silence, the neighbor who noticed the son's late-night comings and goings. Shame accompanied evil, and shame also drove people to speak when the right person asked the right question. He had learned over decades how to find the right person. He would be careful. He would be patient. He would be meticulous until the case sat like a stack of stones on which a jury could not help but descend. But the plan would need more than evidence. He had to become a presence again in the world he had been pushed out of. That meant healing to some extent, yes, but it also meant appearing where the son least expected him: at council meetings, at the bank, in the shadows of the son's comfortable circles. People loved tidy narratives: accidents, grief, the quiet passing of time. He would make sure the narrative was not theirs to write anymore. He would force the question, who profits from the fall? And when they looked for answers there, he would be steady and undeniable. Each imagined move stoked him. Strategy banished the haze of pain. With a plan, his body became a tool again, a thing that could be nursed back to function, sharpened and used. He would not be a raging figure seeking brutal eye-for-an-eye vengeance. That would be exactly what the son expected, a chaotic reaction that could be dismissed as pettiness or derangement. No, he would be surgical, precise, unyielding. He would remove the comfort of denial until his son had to look at the ruin he had caused in the full light of day. Night thinned, and the first real light came washing the cliff in a color that made the stones look like old enamel. He stood with a slow, careful motion, joints complaining, ribs screaming, and felt the world shift under the certainty of his intent. He steadied himself against a jut of rock and breathed until his chest no longer flinched with pain. The vow he had made in whispers down among the broken boulders had changed. It was no longer a private oath, it was a plan with architecture. He would take small steps that felt like surgical strikes, retrieve hidden recordings, track bank transfers, speak with those who had kept quiet for too long. He would move through the legal system like a man rebuilding a house brick by methodical brick. And when the day came that his son was led into a courtroom, when the hushed conversations stopped and the truth was out in the open, the father would stand not as a broken old man, but as the architect of a long overdue reckoning. The canyon no longer seemed like a wound. It was the crucible in which a new, colder patience had been forged. He stepped down from the ledge with a slow, deliberate grace, his purpose heavy, but his gait steady. The world above was waking. The son thought he had gone free. The father walked toward the first pathway back home, knowing that the quiet he sought would not stay quiet for long. What he planned next would not simply expose lies. It would demand that those lies be paid for in full. He pictured it with such clarity that the image felt almost tangible. A courtroom heavy with silence, the kind that settles when truth is about to be spoken. The son would sit there no longer cloaked in charm or the arrogance of unchallenged power, but stripped down to the raw figure of a man who believed he could rewrite destiny by erasing blood. The father imagined the shifting of the jury's eyes, the murmurs from the benches, the judge's gavel silencing the room before the evidence unfolded. It would not be whispered suspicion or the weary complaints of parents dismissed as sentimental. It would be fact cold and undeniable, laid out in sequence, until even the most skeptical stranger saw betrayal carved into its bones. The thought steadied him like a hand pressed against his back. Hope was no longer a fragile dream. It was a weapon. He envisioned the documents unearthed, the ledgers recovered, the witnesses who could no longer hide behind fear or convenience. He pictured the moment bank statements were placed on the table, each signature a silent betrayal, each transaction a nail in the coffin of the lies his son had built. The faces in the crowd would shift from polite indifference to horror, the mask of respectability ripped away in public view. He imagined standing there not as a victim begging for pity, but as a man who had endured the pit of the earth itself and returned with the kind of truth that sears. His voice would not tremble. His body might still bear the scars of the fall, but his words would cut sharper than any wound inflicted on him. He would look directly at his son, and for the first time the boy would be forced to meet his gaze without the shield of arrogance. That meeting alone would be its own kind of justice. He let the image stretch wider past the courtroom into the streets, into the whispers of neighbors and colleagues who once nodded at his son with respect. He could see the headlines not for their drama, but for their clarity. Betrayal of blood parents left for dead, truth emerges. No one would look at his son the same way again. No smile, no handshake, no polite exchange could erase the shadow of what he had done. The father took a slow breath, feeling the sharp air of morning cut through his lungs, and held on to the thought as if it were oxygen itself. Justice was not just a matter of law. It was the weight of society's gaze, the collective judgment that no mask could survive. He remembered how his son had walked through life with ease, charming supervisors, swaying friends, playing roles tailored for each audience. That performance would collapse under the spotlight of truth. The world was cruel in many ways, but it had a long memory when betrayal was exposed. People forgave ambition, forgave greed, even forgave cruelty in business. But a child who tried to kill his parents, no society would ever grant absolution for that. The father tightened his grip on the rough stone beside him, every vein in his hand pulsing with determination. He knew the path to that day would be steep, filled with obstacles placed by lawyers' lies and the inertia of systems designed to favor the cunning. But he also knew patience, and patience was its own kind of power. He had spent years working silently, building structures nail by nail until they stood against the weight of storms. He would build this case the same way, inch by inch, fact by fact, until the structure of justice was unshakable. His wife stirred against him, her breath catching as she whispered his name. He leaned close, whispering back that they would not only survive, they would see the world bear witness. She closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her cheek, not of despair but of fragile belief. That tear fueled him more than rage ever could. It was proof that she still trusted him to deliver them to light, and he would not break that trust again. He thought of the gavel striking wood of the final moment when silence filled the courtroom before the verdict was read. He could almost hear the words guilty hanging in the air, heavy as stone, undeniable as gravity. That sound would not erase the pain of betrayal, but it would etch balance into the ledger of their lives. Their suffering would not vanish, but it would matter. It would stand as proof that truth, though delayed, cannot be buried forever. The sky above the canyon brightened colors, bleeding into one another as dawn stretched higher. The father rose slowly, every bone in protest, but his eyes steady. He looked toward the rim, not with fear, but with intent. He was no longer a man simply crawling out of death's shadow. He was a man walking toward justice, each step a declaration that the end would not be written by betrayal, but by revelation. The canyon would remain a scar, but scars told stories, and this one would speak louder than the silence his son had hoped for. He turned his face toward the rising sun, his jaw set. The reckoning would not come tomorrow or the day after, but it would come. And when it did, the boy who once promised protection would face not only the law of men, but the cold, unblinking law of truth. He let the vision settle inside him, heavy and certain. Justice was not a dream. It was a destination. And as the light grew brighter, cutting through the last shadows of night, he knew he was already walking toward it. What remained was how far he was willing to go to make the world see, and that answer was as sharp as the canyon's edge, as far as it took. The father straightened against the jagged rock, his body torn, but his spirit sharpened into something that could not be broken. The canyon was no longer just a pit where his son had tried to erase him. It was a stage, and the silence pressing in from every wall felt like an audience holding its breath. He had spoken to his wife all through the night, whispering promises, laying out visions of justice and survival. But now his words reached beyond her. His gaze lifted past the rim, past the trees, where betrayal had walked away, and he spoke as if the whole world were listening. He said parents are not meant to be discarded like tools gone dull. They are not burdens to be pushed aside when the shine of youth fades. They are the ones who gave their years, their sweat, their health, so the next generation could stand taller. To betray that is to spit on the very foundation of blood and sacrifice. His voice cracked with both pain and fury, but it carried steady and raw. He told of the nights he worked until his vision blurred, of the meals skipped, so his son could eat, of the dreams shelved, so another life could soar. And then he told of the shove, the cold eyes, the canyon meant to be a grave. He said no parent deserves that end. No father, no mother should ever look into the eyes of the child they raised and see death staring back. He said the world must remember, because forgetting is what allows cruelty to repeat itself. His hand tightened around his wife's, her breath catching as if his words had reached into her chest and steadied her too. She nodded, faintly, tears tracing through the dirt on her face, and the sight of her response only sharpened his resolve. The father raised his head higher, ignoring the blood drying on his skin, ignoring the ache in his chest that made every breath a punishment. He spoke not just for himself, but for every parent who had ever been cast aside, every elder shoved into silence, every sacrifice dismissed as weakness. He told whoever was out there, whoever would hear, that respect for parents is not optional. It is the measure of decency itself. Without it, families rot, communities collapse, and humanity itself becomes hollow. He said, if you believe in justice, if you believe parents deserve dignity, then share his story. Let it travel beyond this canyon, beyond his pain, into homes where children still sit at their parents' tables. Let them hear it and remember before greed blinds them. He urged those listening not to stay silent, not to let his betrayal vanish into the void. Silence is what his son wanted. Noise, outrage, and truth are what would save others from this fate. He told them to stand with him, to speak his name not as a victim, but as a reminder that blood must mean something, that a parent's years cannot be erased with one act of cruelty. His wife clung to his arm, her eyes wide, and for the first time since the fall, she looked less like a broken woman and more like a survivor who had been given a reason to fight. Together they looked upward toward a sky blooming with morning light, and he spoke louder, forcing the canyon itself to hold his words. He said, this is not the end. This is only the first chapter. Justice has not yet been delivered, but it will be. And those who doubt, those who hesitate, those who wonder if truth can rise from darkness, they need only remember this moment. Two parents left for dead in silence, but alive, breathing, and calling for the world to bear witness. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening, and he leaned forward as though speaking directly into the eyes of anyone watching. He told them to subscribe to his story, to stay, because the truth of what came next would be darker, sharper, and more explosive than anything yet told. If betrayal was the opening act, then retribution would be the finale, and no one should look away before it arrived. The canyon fell silent again, but his words lingered, hanging in the morning air, like smoke from a fire not yet seen. He pressed his forehead to his wife's once more, the intimacy of the gesture balancing the fury of his vow. He had called on the world, and he would not let that call go unanswered. And as the light broke fully across the horizon, Painting the stones gold, he whispered one last time, not to his wife, not to himself, but to the unseen listeners beyond the canyon. Stay with me. Share this. Remember, what comes next will change everything. Betrayal from one's own child is a wound deeper than any physical scar. Yet within this story lies a truth older generations know. Respect for parents is the foundation of family, and without it, everything crumbles. A lifetime of sacrifice, working long hours, building a home, giving up personal dreams, should never be repaid with cruelty or indifference. For seniors, this tale is both painful and empowering. It reminds us that while betrayal may shake our faith, resilience and dignity can still guide us forward. Justice does not always come quickly, but patience and truth are stronger than lies. It is a call to never see ourselves as powerless, even when others try to silence or dismiss us. Our voices matter, our stories matter, and demanding respect is not selfish. It is survival. Share this story with those you love. Let it remind them of the sacred duty between parent and child, and stand with us as we insist that no parent should ever be erased. Subscribe and join the conversation because together we ensure these lessons are never forgotten.